How's it going, Blamers? Today, I'm sitting down with Ashley Buckner, a trauma therapist who helps people deconstruct religious conditioning, especially those in high demand religions like Mormonism. We're diving into what that process looks like using part of my own story as an example. Hi, Ashley, and welcome to Blame It on Mel. Can you tell me
Hi.
a little bit about your background?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here. Yeah, I've actually been a therapist, oh my goodness, for like 13 years, 14 years, so a long time. And I did not start my career specializing this. I actually grew up in Utah. I grew up in southern Utah. I was raised Mormon. I lived here till I was 18. And then I actually moved to California for college. And that was kind of the beginning of the end of Mormonism for me. And I became a therapist. I lived in California for 12 years. I didn't actually ever anticipate coming back to Utah.
Oh,
I met my
well, where did you live in California?
I went to college in Los Angeles and then graduate school in San Diego. So I moved from like a little small town in Cedar Cities, South Utah, and then I went to LA, which was a little bit of a culture shock, but it was incredible. I met my husband in San Diego. He's not from here. He has no experience with high demand religion, whatever. But I have a ton of family, and so we decided to move back in 2018 because we wanted to start a family. I have all my family here. California is so expensive. So that's kind of what sparked my interest. I think it was the first time living in Utah since becoming a therapist and understanding mental health and trauma. And so to witness the impact it was having on mental health in Utah, just even as like a citizen. I wasn't a therapist working in the community. I was working at another like a residential facility, so for people out of the state. So I wasn't really working with mental health in Utah, but I just noticed it as a resident, and that was interesting. That was really curious, and it sparked my curiosity just in regards to how mental health is being impacted. And I think a huge component that isn't often talked about, especially in places like Utah.
What were some things within the community that you recognize as impacts on their mental health?
Form of therapy I provide is a body-based form of therapy. It's called brain spotting. I was trained in it in 2022, which then inspired me to open a therapy practice in Utah. I think I just unconsciously knew I needed a trauma-based approach to treat mental health here. And so I started working with the population with the intention to specialize in trauma. So obviously what falls under trauma is so many different things, but I anticipated that's what people were going to come see me for. And that's what people sought me out for. And what I started to notice in these brain spotting sessions, because I essentially watch clients relive trauma and distress when they're working through them in their nervous system, is how many issues and how much distress and trauma was coming from the church. So what I mean by that is like the demands of purity culture, right? The demands of the word of wisdom, the demands of being worthy for eternal salvation and checking all of the boxes for worthiness and wearing your garments and not wearing your garments. I mean, it all just kept coming back to the church. And because I grew up Mormon, I have an intimate understanding of Mormon culture. And that also allows me to be very culturally competent. And when you're treating mental health, wherever you're at, whether you're in Utah or I used to work in inner city San Diego, you have to understand the culture and how the culture is impacting mental health. And unfortunately, I think in predominant Mormon communities, because the church is this incredible supportive place and families can be together forever, it's overlooked, and we're not studying how mental health is impacted by this religion. I went to a suicide prevention training when I first moved to Utah, and I remember sitting there the whole time thinking, when are we going to talk about how Mormonism is impacting this? Like, when are we going to talk about how Mormonism is impacting suicide rates? Because that's a very real issue. People are unaliving themselves because they just do not feel like they can live up to the standards of this religion, but it wasn't talked about at all. And so I don't.
No, I've never heard that. That's really sad. I mean, it's never spun that way. It's never talked about that way. It's usually that they had mental health for other reason, not because they were unable to reach this level of perfectionism.
This is not talked about at all, but I have worked with, like, and also in my online community heard from countless individuals that at 7, 8 years old, right at their baptismal age, they had thoughts of death and dying because they wanted to die to remain clean and pure.
Wow. That's
Mm.
heavy. I just can't even imagine that.
Yeah, very, very common and not talked about and like kind of brushed under the rug. But it just models how so much of church doctrine is not developmentally appropriate for child brains, and so how they'll interpret it, even though, right, like, because they're going to interpret it very literally, or maybe it's not explained in the best way. It's so complex, just the nature of it. And 8 years old, 7, 8 years old is just so young to be receiving those kind of messages, in my opinion.
No, it absolutely is. But that sort of programming, it just starts at such a young age. It's really, I mean, it starts in nursery. It starts in those primary programs and it just follows you your entire life where you feel like you have that pressures of perfectionism that is really hard to achieve. And if you can't achieve it, you best make sure that you are able to put that image out there that you're perfect, right? Because that's really what's most important.
And I would also add, I mean, part of my specialty is developmental trauma, and developmental trauma is anything that occurs 0 to 18 years old. And oftentimes it is not so much the event that happens, but how our caregivers respond to the distressing event. And it's so important to recognize that Mormonism is a caregiver in and of itself. It has rules for everything, and it's influencing parenting to such a degree. So choices and decisions oftentimes are met with shame and guilt instead of like support and love. And also, too, so many children don't feel safe to tell their parents certain things because they're afraid of shame and guilt. I think also, too, generationally, it's so important to look at it, the generational aspects of Mormonism. And if you have any Mormon lineage, I mean, and also like in utero too, right? You're like, messages begin in nursery, but you're also in your mom's utero. She's attending church. You're receiving everything. And you essentially are born with this in your DNA. And I know that sounds a little wild, but just like from what we know about epigenetics and all of that, it lives in your body and comes into the world. So you're wired to be Mormon essentially, which is hard for people to wrap their head around.
Yeah, no, I definitely understand that. So I joined the church when I was 19. So I have a different foundation than like my husband does. But both of us, as we left the church, has still been really, really hard just transitioning because for me, like I am not the person that he married, but I have resorted back to who I was before I joined the Mormon church. And that's not at all the person that he met. And so we have a really hard time as far as transitioning our marriage into something that's totally different. And even just figuring out what our boundaries are. And, you know, now that we're drinking, like, is it okay? How much can we drink when we're separate from each other? It's just it's a really difficult thing because especially like my husband, he's taught, well, when you go to a bar, something bad's going to happen, right? And so if I go out and I go with my friends and we're going out for a couple drinks, he gets very worried that something terrible is going to happen because that's what he has been programmed his entire life. But he knows that it's not going to be bad, but his like programming keeps surfacing and he has a really hard time trusting me to be able to just go have drinks with the girls.
Absolutely. And I think you bring up such an important point in that our nervous system actually doesn't know time and space, and it can be activated by something that's not even actually a real threat in the moment. But because of that early conditioning, because of that early programming around, you know, alcohol being bad, going to a bar, meaning something bad's going to happen, he can consciously know that that's not true, but his body knows different because it lives in the body. And so you just going to the bar with your girlfriends can send him into fight or flight, and not because he is actually in danger, but because his body thinks it is. It just goes back to that very first moment of distress around that. And I would say in the church, it's just repetitive distress, right? And you're too young to really understand what it all means. And you just want to be with your family forever.
So, as a therapist, how do you kind of like deconstruct that?
Absolutely. Great question. Because of the form of therapy I do, so I'll just use this example. I would ask your husband to notice, where does he feel that in his body? Like when
His
he gets,
shoulders.
yeah. So I would have him. So brain spotting is where you look affects how you feel, and we hold a fixed eye position to go access the part of the brain and the body where the trauma and distress is stored. And a lot of times that looks like reliving it because it got stuck there, and so you almost have to like unwind it, and you have to let the trauma responses kind of come up and out of your being. And so that is actually how I specifically work with it. So I would have him laser focus in on that spot. I mean, this is just like the very condensed version, but we'd find an eye and we'd go all the way into it. I'd have him sit with it and notice and be curious. And we would just keep hitting that activation until he no longer could pull it up. That's how I would specifically, as a trauma therapist, target it. I think in a lot of ways too, one way you can work on that is also really grounding and regulating in the here and now. So he has enough awareness to know why feels threatening for you to go. And so part of it is, okay, I feel really activated in my shoulders, but I can feel my feet on the ground and my feet feel grounded. And I'm going to really notice that. And I'm also going to remind my body that this is where we're at right now. And I know my wife's safe, and I know she's not a bad person and nothing bad's going to happen to her, and I'm not at church. And so it's almost like a reparenting of your system a little bit too. You can go that route. I will say that trauma lives in the body, and the only way to actually really release it is to do a body-based approach.
So realistically, it's all in your body, and recognizing what those reactions are doing inside your body. And then you have to train yourself and it's also hard to recognize it. And when your anxiety starts to increase, how do you stop yourself from your anxiety increasing and say, okay, let's take a look at where I'm feeling that in my body? How does someone work through that?
There's a couple points. I think disembodiment and not feeling things in your body is often a survival skill for people in high control religion, because the shame and the distress is so intense. Part of navigating that is by not being in your body. So I think, if that's someone, I'm going to be working with them specifically on how to just start to notice sensations in their body. And we would probably start with like joy or fun and things like that, right? But let's say, someone has a felt sense of that anxiety in their body, and it's like, oh my gosh, it's so much in my chest. I can't take it. I think our first inclination is to want to fight with it and want to make it go away. But if we shove something down or we ignore it, it just gets louder. And so it's not so much about having them go into it, but I would just really have them notice that. But then immediately I would have them scan their body and go really slow, super slow, from the top of their head all the way down to their toes. Can they find a place in their nervous system that feels calm, grounded, or neutral? And I walk them through that. And sometimes they can find it instantly, and some people can't find it at all. But the thing is, there's a difference. You can just keep feeding the anxiety, or you can slowly keep scanning. And the scan, even if you can't find that place, is regulating. So I think more of it too is befriending. This sounds weird, but like befriending the anxiety and being curious about it, because it's just anxiety, anger, fear. They all get a bad rap and they're labeled as bad emotions, but actually emotions are not good or bad. They just are, and they're essential to our survival as human beings. If we don't get scared, how do we keep ourselves safe? If we don't feel anxious, how do we know when we're like borderline, in a precarious situation? And also anxiety is not all bad. Anxiety can help us be motivated and fuel our productivity. And so it's really starting to shift how you see these emotions in a lot of ways. And I think, unfortunately, when you grow up in a high control religion like Mormonism, you're told that certain emotions are the adversary or they're Satan. And so that really skews your relationship. So part of it is kind of increasing your emotional intelligence in a lot of ways, and understanding your feelings as just warning signs and messages of your nervous system. Your body is just communicating with you. It's not that.
Yeah. Like I remember always thinking like if you have to pray, right? You have to pray. We did marriage counseling through LDS services, back a long time ago. And always the answer to everything was that you need to pray together. You need to, like, it's just like everything that you're talking about was never ever explained, never used. It was just, you know what, you need to be reading your scriptures together. You need to be spending more time together. You need to be praying together. Right? Like you are taught to just dive in even further into religion. And, we must not be being obedient enough. We're not serving hard enough or well enough, right? Like, and so it goes back to like obedience and faith, and that is what shows us what is our worth and our value and even the success of our marriages.
Yeah, and that's just such a slippery, dangerous slope because oftentimes the things that you're struggling with are communicating to you that, hey, part of these beliefs are actually kind of harmful and they're creating a lot of distress for you, right?
Yeah,
Just because you're struggling, that doesn't mean your marriage is less than, but that's what you're being told, and so
right.
it's super discouraging, and I think just continues that disconnection from yourself. And when I think about spirituality and people especially that just observe me from like my platform lens, they say that I'm anti-religion, anti-Mormon, and I would actually I'm the most spiritual person since I started helping people work with their nervous system. And because your spirituality and your relationship with a higher power starts from within you, right? And your belief
Yeah.
and your trust within yourself to know your instincts and your emotions and your sensations and that knowing. And I think that's where the foundation for blossoming a higher power is. It's not just like praying more, reading more scriptures. It's like being curious and open to, why am I distressed? Why does this bug me so much? Right? Allowing yourself to have those questions, and religion doesn't teach that.
So we met with the stake presidency because, of course, we stopped going to church for 5 years, but now that I have a podcast, now it's a problem, right? Um, so when we met with them, it's really hard to understand. I think that if you're not Mormon, but we were basically told that like we're apostates, and I'm like, I don't hate the religion. I just feel as though there's a lot of things that are wrong. And I feel like change needs to happen. And change cannot happen if you don't talk about it. Not just the change, but also it's like the self healing in myself because I was silenced for so long to be obedient, to have faith, and to trust those leaders and to do what they say, just kind of like as a robot. And now, for the first time, I'm asking questions. I'm talking about it out loud. This is my sort of therapy, is to be able to work through that. I'm not saying I don't not believe in anything. And I do think that there's a lot of good things within the church. However, there's a lot of things that are not right, that are broken, that I don't agree with. And I don't feel as though I should be painted as this anti-Mormon and have so much hate thrown at me because I'm just asking questions or I'm just sharing my story. These stories are true. I didn't make them up. So they happened, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm anti-Mormon. It has a lot of hurt behind it too, because at the same time, I'm like, I gave so much to this religion and to the people within the religion with serving and being there for so many other people above my own family, to where, and sacrificing my husband in leadership positions in the bishopric. I never saw him on Sundays. It's really hard for me to swallow and take all of the hate. Like, how do I deal with that?
It's been, I'm going to be really honest, Mel, it's been a rough year and a half for me personally. I would say that I mean, I'm 37 and I stopped going to church when I was 20 years old. So I have been out of this religion for a very long time. I did not give all the things. I did not give nearly as much as you, but it has been the attacks, especially the attacks without merit, the attacks without getting to know the human, right? They're really hard to navigate. And I think some of the things that have been helpful for me is I'm a trauma therapist, right? So that's always I want to understand and be curious, why are people behaving in the way that they're behaving? And one thing that's been helpful too is to remember that this is not about me. However, when you're speaking up and you're sharing your story and you're talking about, what happened to you, or what happened when you were in the church, also how you're feeling now, you're representing something that many members of the church do not feel able to do. They do not, it is not, whether that's conscious or not. I would say it's not always conscious. I grew up in the church. I couldn't say that I consciously thought I wasn't allowed to say these things out loud, but I knew I wasn't allowed to say these things out loud, right?
Yeah.
You're not allowed to say anything bad about it. You're not allowed to speak up, and you go
Or
to,
just have or even just have
yeah,
questions.
yes, it wasn't
Yeah.
safe. So you survived
No.
that by being obedient. So you have to realize that's what the collective of the church is. And then you are coming forward and you're speaking and you're sharing your story. And it's so much easier to make you the problem. Mel's the issue. But not what is she hitting in me? Because in my opinion, what you're hitting in them is fear. They're also like, gosh, I wish I could do that. You also represent the solution to so many people's distress. And again, I don't think this is conscious. This just is their nervous system reacting, right? They go into fight or flight because they want out too, or they need support too, but they're so disconnected from it, especially these lifelong members that have it wired in their DNA. They don't have the ability to even maybe zoom out for a second. And again, that does not excuse their behavior, but it helps me understand that this is not about me and that's their pain showing. I also still think though, like, you're being attacked. And yes, it's a keyboard warrior or it's your stake president, which I think is an in-person thing. So when you're being attacked in that way, you go into fight or flight. Yes, no, you're not, like, your life is not maybe being physically threatened, but it is still threatening to have people come at you in that way. So your physiology, your fight or flight response is turning on, which I think in some ways is valid. And it's almost kind of honoring that and grounding and taking care of yourself. I also think something that was really helpful for me was I have like a mentor, a consultant that I go over my cases with, and he has nothing to do with the church, but he said, Ash, why does, like, a system become rigid? Why do they like cling so tightly together? And I was like, I don't know. Can you just tell me the answer, because I'm too upset at this church right now? And he said it's because of trauma. Like, trauma creates rigidity. That's what keeps people safe. And so I think having compassion for members of the church and understanding and the church as a whole. So we're talking about a very traumatized system generationally. If you think about the early foundation of Mormonism, the early saints, whether you agree with what Joseph Smith was doing or not, they endured serious persecution. I mean, like, their livelihood was threatened. They like had to flee all these areas, and then their leaders murdered, and then they crossed the plains into Utah. And I mean, I don't think we could even fathom the trauma that they endured coming to Utah, and then they settled here. And they're a trauma bonded group of individuals. Their survival was dependent on each other. And then we have things like the Mountain Meadows massacre happen because of that fear that something is going to harm them and take away from them. And so we still see, in my opinion, this trauma still lives in the church and the system. It is still very, very rigid. It is like there's no accountability. There's no ownership. There's no, hey, I'm so sorry. Even with the recent garment change, all you have to do is say, like, we recognize that so many people were harmed and shamed for showing their shoulders, and we're really sorry for that. And we recognize how we played a role. That sentence in and of itself shifts the whole dynamic, right? But in order to do that, you have to be able to take ownership for your own shame. And this system has so much trauma and so much shame, it just gets more rigid and more hardened, and like makes you and me and anyone else who wants to tell their stories the enemy. And that compassion has helped me.
I feel like they're wanting to rewrite my story. So so like now we can show our shoulders, right? And so it's basically like saying that's not true. You never had to wear these cap sleeves. You know what I mean? Like you don't get to rewrite this story. And for me to say when I first joined the church, I wore a cross. And I was told I was not allowed to wear a cross. I was told that by leaders, and all of these people have come out and said that's untrue. My kids wear crosses, or I wear a cross, or whatever it is. And I'm like, that is untrue. There is nobody that wears a cross in the Mormon church. You won't find a cross anywhere inside any building, any temple, any sort of anything that is church related. You will not see a cross. I don't understand why there is so much of that where they're wanting to rewrite my story, because it's very hard and it's triggering for anybody when you're trying to speak your truth and they want to take your truth away. Wearing a skirt to church, you have to wear a skirt or a dress. It is on the church website. It has recommendations of what you can wear. And then people coming out and saying, well, sister missionaries are allowed to wear pants. Well, they can wear pants when they are tracking. Yes, they can. But when they go to the temple and they go to church services, they still have to wear a dress or a skirt. It's just really hard when you are speaking your truth and you're basically being painted out as a liar.
Absolutely. I've been actually thinking about this a lot lately because of the garment change and just and the cross thing. My grandma was Catholic, and I had like a little Precious Moments cross as a little girl, and I wasn't allowed to hang it in my room. And my mom wasn't like a hardcore Mormon, but that was just culturally.
Yeah.
She grew up Mormon. She has Mormon ancestors. We weren't that Catholic cross. That cross was not going in my room as a little girl. And now, I mean, the whole culture knew that. And so
yeah,
I've been thinking about this a lot lately, because to me, change without accountability is just a PR move. It's just brushing things under the rug. It's manipulation. It's dismissal. I think the confusion in keeping members confused is part of the control. So they don't ask questions, right? It's like the gaslighting. Well, you guys wanted to show your shoulders. Now you can. You're good.
Wait, why is that? Why is that part of the control, keeping them confused? How does that work as far as mental manipulation? Because I don't understand that.
So for members, right, they're in this church, especially, and they're believing and they're following all the rules, and now, they're going to make this change, and they might feel confused, but they're listening to us, so it's okay. It's like, not clear, it's not direct, there's no ownership, there's no accountability, and it's subtle little ways. And so you're kind of in a state of like a mental mind fuck kind of, and that makes you easier to manipulate.
Because as well as I do, and I've said this to some of the people on my comments, is that I'm like, send me a picture on Sunday of the women at your church. There's not going to be anybody in pants. We are oppressed. It is just the way it is in this church. And there is so many women that are leaving. I have a ton of friends that have left and their husbands haven't left. Women are leaving, and they're leaving for a reason, because they are oppressed. We are not equals. Women are not equal to men. And I don't know how we're living in this century and we're still how are women okay with that? Why did it take me so long to catch on to that too?
I mean, I guess that was actually one of the questions I had for you. I was curious about why you joined the church.
Is what really happened is I became very, very wild my freshman year of college, and I had a fake ID. I went to a bar and I was date raped. The last thing I remember was drinking my first drink. I was there with a friend. She is a Mormon, and she was not she was a Jack Mormon, right? Like that's the term. So she's drinking. She has sex with her boyfriend. She's not well, nobody knows that, of course, right? She's putting on the appearance that she's perfect, but she's having this alternate life. She went to the bathroom and came out and I was gone. And so I woke up in a basement somewhere. It was horrific for me. But after that, I realized like I really need to turn my life around or I'm going to end up dead. And I started going to church with her because she went to church every Sunday, right? Even though she was doing all of those things. But I had a really skewed idea of what Mormonism was because my friend, the only person that I knew that was Mormon, she was just like me, right? And so once I joined this church and then I found out you can't wear your cross and you can't drink, you can all of these things. But I was kind of like to the point where I was like, I really shouldn't be drinking at this point. I'm 19. It's not legal anyways, right? Like I need to slow down. But even just I can't drink coffee. It was really, really hard for me. And I'm not really the type of person that loves to be controlled or told what to do. So it was something that I feel like I must have done it just out of a survival instinct more than anything, because that is not in my nature to be told what to do.
What's coming up for me, right? You had just endured a very significant trauma. And there's so many layers to that. And I say this all the time. I think the church is so good at providing the remedy for this type of distress. I think they add to it, but I think what they offer is so enticing.
Also, I had an abusive boyfriend at the time. I went to BYU, Idaho very soon after that. So I went to that school and I started meeting these guys and I'm like, they're great. Like, I don't know if I am going to stay with this religion, but if I'm going to marry someone, I'm going to marry a Mormon guy. They just have the appearance of just being really nice. And that was really enticing to me because I came from a very abusive home. I wanted a different marriage than what my parents had. I wanted all of that happiness because they truly do lay out this plan of happiness. And of course, yes, I want that. I had so much trauma in my early childhood and also just being date raped that that's something that I wanted. However, it was very difficult because once I started dating these return missionaries, you would get to a point in your relationship where you're starting to be serious. And I would tell them, because you're talking about how many people you've kissed and things. And I'm like, oh, kiss. Like I couldn't even give you a list of how many people I've kissed. Like who makes that list? you
What?
know, but I can tell you how many guys I've had sex with. And that is not okay because they had kept themselves pure, right, for so long. And so they're fresh off their mission. They're looking for somebody that is also pure. And it was really hard for me because was told when I was baptized that all of my sins had washed away, right? And so I didn't understand how I could be judged and I would get ghosted. And I feel like that should be a given as a convert is that, of course, you're not a virgin. Like, of course, because the rest of the world, like, if you have a boyfriend, you're having sex with them. That is a normal thing outside of the church. But I was really shamed and I wasn't confident that I was even going to be able to find somebody that wanted to marry me.
I think what's coming up for me too is you're really showing the example of how they get you in, they convert you. And correct me if I'm wrong, but my dad was baptized when I was 10, but I remember it was like the coolest thing ever. When you're converting to Mormonism, you're celebrated, you're seen, you're recognized.
Yes.
And how do you say no to that? That's all we want as human beings is to be seen and held and loved in that way. So you get that and they get you in and it feels like you're on cloud nine, you're on top of the world and your sins are washed away. But then these like subtle purity things start chipping away at you. Right. And so you're already it's not so blatant. it's not like the abusive relationship where the guy's like punching you in the face, right? Which is so easy to see and name the abuse. It's really subtle. It's feeling judged. It's feeling like, oh, I'm not a virgin, right? Like all of those types of things chip away at you. And then it creates more distress. But then what's the solution to the distress? Finding the husband, following all the rules, checking all the boxes, doing all the things. And you just keep going around and around.
Yeah, no, it was really hard. And as a convert, you meet with your bishop regularly. You don't just meet with them if you have something, some sort of sin. So you meet with them regularly. And I was telling my bishop, and he was a really, really nice guy. Honestly, I felt like he was probably the most non-judgmental Mormon that I've ever encountered. And he just had told me, like, don't tell them. Don't tell them. It didn't happen. Like you are washed away. So if God forgives you and God believes that this did not happen, then it didn't happen. It's honestly none of their business. And so I did that, right? And so I was at BYU for 3 years before I met my husband, and I didn't tell him. I didn't tell him, and it was really, really difficult because I did decide to tell him. It was just a couple days before our sealing in the temple. And I told him, and I mean, he definitely had a reaction. And because not just had I been date raped, but I had also had an abortion. And I told him all of that. At the time, I didn't know that he had a hard time with it, but he did later on because he felt like he was lied to, understandably so. But at the same time, like I was doing what I was told, right? I was obedient. That is how you're programmed. And honestly, because of the obedience, it worked, right? Like I did find somebody that wanted to marry me, but I did have to be deceitful about it. But I was being deceitful in the name of the church, right? And so that caused a lot of problems within our marriage because he felt as though I wasn't honest with him. And if I was hiding that, what else was I hiding, right? I mean, those are all natural feelings, but that carried over into our marriage for a lot of years.
And I think it's just that the purity culture messages just literally get wired into people's being. And I learned this from another religious trauma therapist, but purity culture is a form of sexual abuse. And this is why, because it skews people's ability to understand what's age appropriate sexual development. In my opinion, at 19 years old, it makes sense that you like would have had sexual partners, right? Anywhere else besides like a high control purity culture, that's normal age appropriate development. Even when you were talking about like the guys that weren't Mormon, right? That they were screwing around, maybe doing inappropriate things. Like that's part of being 19 to 25 years old.
Right.
You're dumb. I don't mean that in a mean way, but you just mess up. You make poor choices. You hook up with people. You date terrible boyfriends. Like you figure all of that out, right? But Mormonism strips that of people. Members make very significant life decisions before their brain is fully developed, and then that sticks with you for such a long time. And I think it makes sense to me that like no shade to your husband, right? But that purity culture still lives within him. I know for myself, I've had to deconstruct some really deep rooted purity things that didn't really surface until I had kids. And I was like, what is this? I was having a fine, happy sex life until I had babies, but all of our trauma is stored in our psoas muscles, or that area of the body. And when you have a baby, it like reignites everything. And then purity culture in and of itself is sexual abuse. And so I think like really having to confront some of those early purity culture messages and how that impacts your perception of your partner, but also yourself. And for so many people growing up in this culture with these high control purity standards, and I would even imagine too for yourself too, Mel, I would imagine there was so much shame associated with even that trauma that happened to you, the blame, right, for drinking, like all of that stuff. It makes it so layered and complex. But we don't learn how to take ownership of our sexuality. And so if I know that she's had sex with these guys, like that's a threat to me, but it's not meant to be a threat, but you don't have ownership of your sexuality.
And then also, we ended up having sex before our sealing, then, right? Because once I told him that I had sex with some other people, then I don't know, like, from a therapeutical standpoint, it's kind of natural, right? Where you're like, well, you know what? I guess I should probably have sex with him. Does that sound really crazy?
I mean, I think I go back to like what's developmentally appropriate. We're hardwired to have sex. I mean, we are sexual beings. Those things turn on. I'm not saying I don't think it's appropriate for a 13-year-old to have sex, but puberty is when all of this turns on. So to say that people are not going to have sex before they get married in their mid-20s, it just doesn't make sense to me, And I think like I have no judgment for that.
Yeah, I mean, but at the same time, then we have that hanging over our heads too, because we didn't call off our wedding, right? So we still went and we got married in the temple, even though we had been naughty and we had sex before we were married. And so then anytime something went wrong within our marriage, I kept going back to that and thinking, well, that's why, because we had sex before our sealing. That's why we're cursed forever. And that's ingrained. That it really is, because that's kind of what's taught in a way. Like, I didn't just come up with that on my own. I didn't just make that up.
No, not at all. And it's honestly, you having sex before marriage was not the issue. The issue is you're part of a group that says the only way you can get to the highest level of heaven is by doing all of these things, including entering the temple. And the only way you can enter the temple is if you're pure or you've repented. That's the problem. That's the distress that you've been taught that doing something that's natural in a relationship with someone you're going to marry is the problem. That's not the issue. The issue is religion is telling you that that's the problem and that you're not going to get to the highest level of heaven and you've made a mistake and you broke all the rules. That's so distressing for the nervous system that, of course, maybe even to this day, you're like, yep, we're cursed for that one choice. It doesn't make any sense. I actually posted a reel today about coffee. It's not the coffee that's the issue. It's the conditional salvation that's the issue. That's the problem.
It's a lot to have to live up to. It was really difficult to try to strive to this level of perfectionism. And truly, I was really close. Like, even the things that I've done, like after, like having kids and starting to serve, and, I was in the Relief Society presidency, the primary presidency, I was in Young Women's presidency. So my husband's in the bishopric. So we were doing a really good job of showing that we, have that level of perfectionism. We have 5 kids. I look like this after having 5 kids, because if you look like this, God has blessed you, right? God blessed me to look like this because I've done all of those things right. And that is so ridiculous that's what's ingrained in us, isn't it?
Oh, it absolutely is. It absolutely is. And I think that's also part of the survival too, right? We find if we can do all of those things and we can be perfect and we can check all those boxes and look a certain way. I mean, I still to this day struggle with that. Like, I gotta look perfect. And I haven't been in church for a very long time. But if we can do that, then it feels safer. Then we're okay. It's a way to navigate the distress, even though it just creates more distress. But when you're doing it, when you're living it, it's out of survival. It's an adaptation of the nervous system to survive this system. in a lot of ways. And, I think it's important to zoom out and like, okay, well, what if I wouldn't have done some of those things? You would have had to deal with judgment, possibly. You would have probably been, it would not have been okay for you to say no to any of those callings. Like, I mean, the aftermath of
Yeah.
that too. So it's understanding why you chose to do it. And in my opinion, even the obedience, even not seeing the oppression is a survival skill. It's how you survive a system. And I talk about this. I see so many women, they will join the side of the oppressor. I've heard so many stories of women or shaming their daughters or teaching their daughters or their granddaughters very toxic behavior. And they've become the perpetrator in a lot of ways. And I zoom out and look at that. I'm like, well, that's how you win in the system. If you agree with the men and you're on their side and you join the oppressor, you're surviving. And that I'm not justifying it or making it okay, but I have to understand, why are so many women doing this?
No, and I actually have a really good example of doing just that because when I was in the Young Women's Presidency. All right, Blamers, that's where we'll stop for today. When Ashley joins me next week, we take a hard look at bishop interviews with minors, why these one-on-one conversations about sexual behavior are unsafe, unnecessary, and they're harmful. It's heavy, but it's important. And part 2 is all about breaking that silence. See you next week, Blamers.